Okay, actually, that's the same thing. Here we have deficits in nonverbal communication, so that's the second subdomain after social reciprocity. And again, here are examples. And you would expect to meet more than one example within a subdomain, and everyone should have something in each subdomain. So we're trying to be a bit tighter here so that we're not diagnosing the world with ASD. Finally, the third subdomain has to do with deficits in forming relationships. We've put imaginative play in here in part because we didn't know where else to put it. But it includes making friends, changing behavior and context, and as relevant to very small kids, interest in other people beyond your mother. So again, this is not a complete list. The idea is that you could add your examples, but the domain is specified. In addition, all individuals who have ASD have to have some kind of restricted and repetitive behavior, and they have to have these behaviors in at least 2 of these 4 different dimensions. And these have changed slightly, actually, since IMFAR. So we've tried to spread these out a little bit. And again, this is, remember, DSM-5 is the consensus, often on the telephone, of 15 people, all of whom have their opinions. So you'll see some of that in here. It's a stew. So we have repetitive things, including stereotype behavior and movements or use of objects. We have routines, rituals, and resistance to change. So resistance to change is back in. We have fixated interests, preoccupations, circumscribed interests. And then we have behaviors where our implication, we don't really know why, is that the person is responding in an unusual way to sensory input. So even though this may seem more restrictive, that you have to have 2 of them, there are more options here than there were before. So these just give you examples. Again, these are not intended to be exhaustive lists of examples. You can add your own examples. And then I thought just to take a break from me talking for a second, we could have the video. It's just a break. This is a little boy, so he was doing number 1.
What do you do? Mommy help? Oh, you got it. You're so smart. Good job. Good job. That's classic, so it won't break. But there's a clown in this book, so I keep, so every time I come to it, I'm like, ooh, yay, clown. Yeah, I can look like it. Oh my goodness. And now he gives the clown kisses, so hopefully if we ever
trying to separate them out too much isn't a terribly useful enterprise at this point. Yet we want to try to give people enough examples so that they can easily make diagnoses. So this is adherence to routines and resistance to change. These are fixated interests, preoccupations, circumscribed interests, and then, I'm going to skip this, and then sensory reactions, both over and under. Okay. There's also a proposal, and I'm going to go through this quickly, but for a new diagnosis that is not under ASD, which is social communication disorder. This will look familiar to those of you who knew pragmatic disorder. It's new, and we don't really know if it's going to work or not. But the idea is to accommodate individuals who do not have any repetitive behavior, with the assumption that they may have much milder social deficits related to pragmatics. So this falls under the category of social communication disorder. You have to exclude autism, though, before you can make this diagnosis. And I think the worry is that many kids get stuck in this diagnosis, at least in the US, who really do have ASD, because people don't either want to bring it up or don't look at the repetitive behaviors. So we're hoping that will not happen. Okay. We now talk about specifiers. The idea in DSM-5 is that autistic disorders are neurobiological in origin, and sometimes we know what that etiology is, like tuberous sclerosis, and sometimes we don't. So breaking kids down by etiology, it gets very confusing, because it isn't that kids don't have etiologies, it's just that we don't know them. So the idea is, for right now, until we have a better sense of what etiologies are, autism is defined by behavior, no matter what the etiology is, and then you add in a specifier stating the etiology. So if there's a little girl who looks like she has autism, and she has Rett syndrome, she can have autism and Rett syndrome. If she has Rett syndrome and doesn't look like she has autism, she doesn't have autism, which is true sometimes. Same thing with Fragile X. Same thing with any particular genetic abnormality. This could also be true for other kinds of medical factors. So cerebral palsy, you could have ASD and cerebral palsy, or ASD and seizures. So we're not ignoring the biological, we're just saying to have it half in and half out is confusing. Okay. Early history is also a specifier. So, but we know, and again, Sally's talk was a good example, that we don't really know when ASD starts. So we're reporting age of perceived onset. It's not a criteria. We just are reporting it, and whether a parent reports a loss, and what it is. Okay. And so that's a way to include childhood degenerative disorder. And again, here we could have examples where you have ASD and then with, and you specify these things. So it isn't that we want to ignore these things, we just don't want them in the diagnostic criteria. Finally, all of the DSM-5 categories have some kind of assessment of overall impairment. And the basic assumption is you do not have ASD unless you have some kind of impairment. If you are walking down the street and you see someone who is minding their own business and doing fine, who is doing things that look like ASD, you have no right to diagnose them. No, they have to have something where they need help. So there are a list of various factors that contribute to impairment in any kind of psychological or psychiatric disorder. So difficulties in developmental level, adaptive functioning, language level, hyperactivity, sleeping problems. So all of those things are considered, as well as co-occurring medical or psychiatric disorders, depression or anxiety. And then you take that, as well as the specific impairment in ASD, and use that to discuss how much difficulty is this person having. Now, we had to come up with ranges of impairment within ASD. And this was actually the most controversial thing when I presented this to the American Autism Society, were this notion of having to have these levels. We've separated social communication from repetitive behaviors, because although we're saying everyone needs both, you can have people who have very specific interfering repetitive behaviors and less severe social deficits within autism. And the way these severity rankings are made is by how much help or support you need. That also helps us address the situation where you have an adult in a very well-supported environment who is doing great, and no one wants that person to lose their support because they're doing well. On the other hand, we need to acknowledge how much support they've had to have. So this is level of support, and these have to do with how much the behavior requires the support. You'll notice that we still have in here a subclinical. I don't think this is going to go in DSM-5, but the idea that there are people who have some of these symptoms but do not need support, they then do not have ASD. So off we go in search of biological markers. And I think in the end, all of us, or many of us at least, feel like, we will never completely cure autism for everyone until we know the biology. On the other hand, we have lots of evidence that we can change behavior and perhaps really significantly change trajectories by the things that we do that are behavioral. So we can't just wait for the biology. I think it's also important to come back to the idea, and again, this was something Nancy Minshew was talking about in a general way yesterday, that autism is something more than the sum of its parts. We need to divide it up because we want to be able to address what areas people want help in. On the other hand, there is something more about having a social deficit and a repetitive behavior or strong repetitive interest or strong resistance to change that is different from either of those separated. And the fact that language disorders and intellectual disabilities often accompany those things makes life different for the people that have it. So I think one proposition is, can ASD become something that's more like a term like cerebral palsy? Now, I think the nice thing about cerebral palsy is that it implies different etiologies, a range of severities. It can be something that causes major impairment, or it can be something much more subtle. There are predictable trajectories. It can be treated. And we hope prevented. It can be prevented in some ways. And it's something that every pediatrician pays attention to. I mean, just the question of, can this child walk? How are they using their hands? We would want them to have the same attitude for just, is this child looking at their parent? Are they vocalizing back and forth? Not as if it's a huge category that you don't want to go to, but rather this is an ordinary part of screening. Okay. In the end, our goal is to figure out what goes awry and then to try to figure out how we can represent that so that we can all communicate with each other. And on that note, I want to thank the collaborators in trying to analyze data for DSM-5. Again, this is the group's effort, not mine, and thank all the people that funded it and the children and families who put up with us asking them to come in all the time and help us. So thank you very much. Okay.